So in this module, we're going to look at quality mindset. So this really describes how your quality organization sees the world around it, but also how your sort of peer functions within your business see your quality organization, and also how they see the QMS as a business process and system within your organization. So in this first session, we're going to look at systems. These are some of the questions we'll cover in the following sessions. Really, how do you and your organization see the world around you? How does that world around you view your quality organization? And importantly, how do others see your organization in terms of how it sits within your business and its role and its function and its value to your business? So first, we're going to start looking at worldviews in terms of how individuals see the world, and then we're going to move on to systems and a bit about systems in action, and then that will lead on to how the QMS operates, as a system. So essentially, there are two worldviews. There's one of order, in terms of you see the world as very predictable. The path forward is very unambiguous. It's very clear, and this really contrasts with the other way of seeing the world, in that you see the world as very disordered, events unpredictable. Basically, the path forward is very unclear, and different individuals and organizations will see the world in different ways. Some will be at one extreme in terms of always feeling the world is very, very structured in terms of the way it's presented, and others will see the world as being more chaotic in terms of constantly moving. So really, this next session really is where you position yourself and your organization in this sort of spectrum of worldviews. So I'll start with two questions. One is around organisation. Is your business in the place you predicted it to be 5 to 10 years ago? Probably not. And conversely, is your life in the place you predicted it to be when you were younger? And also, the answer to that is probably not. In some aspects, it may be your life plan had gone to sort of plan, but in many respects, I'm sure your life has been impacted by events, and it's not in the place you expected it to be many years ago. So essentially, organisations would like the world to be very ordered, and factories and businesses would like the world to be very, very structured. But in reality, that's not the case. And very often, our worldview of the world is somewhere in between this order and disorder. We hope and expect the world to be very structured, but we realise and we understand that is not always the case. Our own experience from the past is that hasn't been the case. So we usually sit somewhere in the spectrum in the middle in terms of our view of these two, ordered versus not ordered, types of the world. So where you fit on this spectrum will very often be dictated by how you feel about this statement. So we'll cross that bridge when we come to it. So where you feel about that statement, if that makes you feel very, very uncomfortable, then you're probably more to the left-hand side of the spectrum in terms of wanting a more ordered world. And if you think that's really quite, I'm quite comfortable with that, then you're probably in the position of being more to the right of that spectrum. So really, very often it gives how you answer this question, or how you feel comfortable with this statement, gives some indication of where you are in terms of the spectrum, in terms of order and disorder. Now, an engineer will usually approach things with a very reductionistic mindset. That's basically their training and their experience, in that their expectation is you can generally break things down into subcomponents or understand them. You can control inputs and you can verify outputs. But the general question I've got really is that really the case when you apply that to organizations? Organizations are not machines. We would like them to be machines. We would like factories to be machines where we basically put raw materials in one end and we get the product out the other, and it's actually very, very controlled. But that's not always the case. Factories are living, moving, breathing beasts, and because they've got people in, and people don't act like machines. So one of the attributes of organizations is that they're constantly moving, and they're very often hard to pin down. So we'll come on to that in the next module in terms of complexity. But very often when you go and try and control an organization with using the sort of tools that an engineer would use, very often it becomes a bit frustrating as you struggle to sort of pin down the organization and bring control, which is often difficult with an organization. Even though you can do it with some of the sub processes within the business, you can't do it to the whole entity in terms of the business once you start adding people and such like into the mix. So this module really explores where an engineering world helps and is extremely valuable. So I'm not dismissing an engineering view of the world, and also times when it doesn't help, and at times it may even hinder your ability to actually see and influence the world. So this session is not a criticism of engineering or that approach in terms of its ability to actually attempt to gain control over systems. That is very laudable. But this is really a conversation of, sometimes that really is useful and helps, and sometimes it actually doesn't work, and sometimes it even hinders in terms of progression. Now, as a leader, you're basically in this conundrum where you want certain things to be very very predictable. So you would like, as a leader, to actually expect that your goals of your direct reports to deliver on time. You would expect your production line to deliver as you expect. You'd expect your business to grow as you expect. So you've got this innate desire as a leader to actually have a very predictable and a very ordered world. Um, and that's very laudable. This conflicts with some of the other expectations we expect from leaders in terms of we'd like leaders to have environments where, and we talked about it in the previous sessions, and we'd like a diverse population of individuals. We'd like different views. We'd like a nice mix of viewpoints and stances. And we'd also like, a business that's very agile, that's very nimble. It can move, it can change, it can make changes very quickly. Now, one of the conflicts a leader has is that there is this tussle between the world of predictability and the world of agility and diversity. And this is the theme that will run through a lot of these sessions in terms of this conflict between an ordered state of the world versus a disordered and a moving state of this world. And we'll come on to that in this session and the session on complexity. So over the last 10, 15 years, the process view of the world has been replaced by a more systems view of the world. So we understand now that organizations just aren't a collection of processes knitted together. They are actually discrete systems in terms of how those processes interact with other sub-processes within the organization. And this systems view of the world has been applied to a range of organizations, from healthcare to social settings. And one of the fundamental understandings is that you can't understand the whole organization unless you understand the whole system and address problems with the underlying system. So you can work on sub parts of the system, but really you need to take a holistic look in terms of understanding the whole totality of the system to really understand it. And by definition, our QMS is a system, but very often we don't really see it as a system. We're very often focused on the sort of the sub processes within the QMS, be they CAPA or non-conformance or management review, and we don't really often think about, as well as we should, in terms of those are actually all knitted together to make a complete system that is the QMS. Now, in 2003, John Seddon proposed a model for checking how a system works and does offer some structure in terms of how you look at a system. And his model comprises of 6 steps. So in the next couple of slides, we'll step through in terms of his model for checking a system in terms of how it behaves and how you can better understand it. Now, one of the aspects of systems is you can understand them. So basically, they may be very complicated and hard to understand, but generally there is a direct relationship between cause and effect, and you can model the system. And this is unlike more complex systems where the relationship between cause and effect doesn't hold. And we'll come on to that in a subsequent session. And in complex systems, basically, this cause and effect relationship is broken, and the system is continually moving. And basically, you can get effects that are unexpected, and you can get unintended consequences. But in terms of simple systems, which we'll cover here, They may be very complicated, but you can actually model them and you can begin to understand them. So the first question you need to ask yourself is what is the purpose of the system? What is it for? What are the purpose of the subsystem? So as an example for the QMS, in terms of the Kappa system, is it in place to fix and prevent errors and to continually improve the QMS? Or is it there to actually create documents to demonstrate to an auditor that you've got a Kappa process and you meet the regulations? These are obviously two different things, though they're often confounded. So basically, if each of the subsystems of the QMS, you need to ask yourself, what is its purpose? So looking at any system, the first question is, what's the purpose of the system as a whole? So the next attribute is around demand, and the first question is what are the demands on the system? Now every system has a degree of demand on it, and the QMS is no different. And there are two types of demand. There's value demand, which is basically demand that's actually fulfilling the requirements of the system to meet a value in terms of the eyes of the customer. And in terms of the QMS, it's the three customer groups we covered in the session previously. And the other type of demand, failure demand, is basically the failure of the system to actually to deliver value to the customer. So failure demand within the QMS would be errors in manufacturing records which have to be corrected, degrees of rework, customer specifications that are incorrect, doing product development requiring the product to be redesigned before launch. So basically the system working, but it's not meeting the requirements of the customer's expectations for value. And if anything, it's going against that in terms of delaying fulfilling this value need. So other types of failure demand would be, and some good examples are in call centers in terms of you ring a call center with a problem, and they don't take all your details, and basically they've got to ring you back, and there's this iterative loop where basically you go through a series of calls and you really never get your issue sort of resolved at all. And in terms of failure demand, very often in organisations there's work generated by the system, and the QMS is no different. That it gives the illusion that the system's working and moving, and it's meeting value demand, but actually it's completely delinked and detracting from the ability of the system to meet the final customer needs. So it's things that are happening that looks as if work is being done and the customers are being satisfied, but actually it's nothing more than a mirage, and the system just operating and meeting no value at all in terms of the customer requirements. So basically the system itself creates its own work in a great extent. So examples of that with the QMS would be you've got reports that are created that are actually never read by anybody. You've got data that's compiled that's never reviewed, or data that's reviewed with no decision. So really ask yourself how much daily activity within your QMS on a day-to-day basis actually directly linked with you fulfilling your customer needs in terms of compliance, business health, and customer experience. And I'm sure that you can identify a lot of activity that looks as if it's good stuff going on in terms of meeting the customer requirements, and might be at first glance maybe thought of as being value demand, but actually you'll probably unpick that it's actually failure demand, and it's just the system basically creating its own work and activity. The next question is around capability in terms of how capable the system is. Is the system capable of meeting the load that's put on it? So the question for the QMS is when you put load on it, how will the quality system meet peaks of demand or events such as product recalls and external audits that put very sudden stress on the organisation and the system and its human resources. So it's not just whether the system can actually meet the demand during normal times. What's its stretch capacity in terms of capability, in terms of these though rare events, but predictable events in terms of a QMS. So very often you see examples where there's an internal or there's an external audit in terms of the QMS, and everything stops in terms of focusing on either preparing for that or hosting for that audit. And obviously that's a huge demand on the QMS. So the QMS has to be able to actually sort of absorb that demand during these sort of these exceptional events, which though exceptional, are very predictable. The next question is around flow, how the system flows to meet this demand. Now, the system isn't static. It needs to flow to meet demand, and the transactional processes within your QMS are a great example of the system flowing. So doing the product realization process within the QMS, how do your records flow with the document? How do your records flow with the product in terms of that flow? How do you manage this flow? Is it done by paper records following the physical product around, or was it done with electronic systems, linked with ERP and EQMS? And obviously, if you can improve that flows, how the information flows through your QMS, and obviously flows with the product, that's obviously far better in terms of delivering value to your customer than if you can't do that. And to a great extent, managing flow within different applications, each with their different business owners, actually in many ways can actually decrease your ability to manage flow. So you may have electronic systems, but they may be in different sort of databases and disconnected. So individually they may look as if they're very efficient, but when you stitch them together, you find that actually those separate databases aren't actually helping the flow of the quality system to run in terms of those sort of subsystems. And this is especially the case around product realization in terms of flow of information and the flow of data with the physical product as it moves through your plant. The next one's our system conditions, and really this is a real question around what causes the system to behave as it does, and are the subsystems are they linked? Now we talk about the quality management system and we talk about subsystems of the QMS, but very often we don't really we don't connect them as subsystems as well as we should. So one example would be the subsystems of the QMS around design control and product realization. So very often and described on the right hand side of this slide, doing design control, you pre-launch, you create your product and then it's transferred into production, and then doing launch and product realization in the real world manufacturing, you get you will potentially get non-conformances and CAPA events and complaints the manufacturing systems will have to go through a degree of change control and retraining and training. So there's a whole load of activity that happens after you launch a product, and very often the product is launched with a bit of teething problems that need to be ironed out. What tends not to happen is that the product realization part of the QMS doesn't always talk back to the design control part of the QMS, such that your next product you launch and you design and build is actually built better than the previous ones. Very often organizations aren't very good at taking this post market data and making sure that it feeds back into the design control system to design a better product. And very often what happens is that the product is thrown over the fence into manufacturing and basically it's off you go and we've done our job. So this attribute really talks about how your system is connected in terms of how it behaves and how you can make it behave in terms of making these connections between the subsystems. The last one is around management thinking in terms of a system, and really, systems don't operate on their own. They require people, and managers generally are responsible for parts of the subsystem. And this question really is around: are your managers focused on your customers as opposed to just running that part of the subsystem? Are they satisfying your customers' needs? And people are driven by beliefs and behaviours that make up this concept of organizational culture, and basically the system functions as it does, not as an aberration, but because people behave as they do. And we'll talk about culture in quality of culture in a subsequent session in terms of, but it is the foundation of how the QMS behaves. The QMS isn't a thinking entity. Basically it involves people to design it and build it and maintenance it and obviously run it. So the management thinking of how the QMS operates is really quite important in terms of understanding how that system actually operates on a daily basis and how it evolves and changes. So just in the next couple of slides, just talk about systems generally and some systems you'd recognise. Obviously, one of the biggest changes, impacts on society over the last number of years has been the COVID-19, pandemic, and this was a clear example of an interconnected society in terms of it behaving as a system. The healthcare system and the economies, were interconnected on a global scale, and it basically highlighted that each of the components, you couldn't tinker with one of them without having some sort of effect in terms of impact on another. Very often with unintended and intended, circumstances. So the slide here is taken from a paper really describing a systems thinking approach in terms of vaccination to control the virus. In terms of you move one area and change one area and it impacts another. So all of the attributes of our response and how we live, sort of that pandemic really do show systems in action in the real world. Another example of a systems approach is actually taken from the UK government's approach to net zero in terms of building a greener world in terms of reducing the CO2 emissions down to zero, and a big part of that is actually the use of and the promotion of electrical vehicles. And this diagram is taken from one of the government reports in terms of how what are the things and the levers you could use to increase demand and generation of in terms of the use of electric vehicles. And it's really a key component. Systems thinking is beginning to be a key component in the thinking of organizations and governments in terms of how the world behaves. So it's moved away from sort of an academic approach, but more organizations and whole sort of governments are using this methodology to understand the world. And obviously the reason for that is if you can understand the world far better, then you actually start to influence it in terms of the outcomes you want. So another example of how a systems approach can help is the opioid crisis that's been unfolding in the US for the last 3-4 years, in terms of a large number of people have become addicted to basically prescription tranquilizers prescribed by their doctors for ailments such as headache and backache and such like. Such is the number of deaths and overdoses. The initial response of the sort of the policymakers and the healthcare environment was to actually try and reduce the number of prescriptions for these drugs with the hope that it would reduce the number of deaths. However, this had the opposite effect in terms of once patients were unable to actually get their drugs from their doctor, very often they'd go to other legal and often illegal means in terms of actually feeding their addiction in terms of use of heroin and such like on the street, or even synthetic drugs, which were synthetic opioids in terms of which were far more powerful than the original prescription. So basically, this is an ongoing issue within the US. Since 2019, over 70,000 people have actually died, and really sort of there's virtually sort of 1.6 million are still actually misusing prescription painkillers, to date. And basically, this is one of the big focus in the US in terms of healthcare and basically a healthcare emergency. One of the things the FDA realized is that you're looking at it in a very machine-like way, and especially after the attempted intervention in terms of the reduce the number of overdoses, they needed to look at it in a different way, and they concluded that a systems approach would be an appropriate way to look at this issue. And the reason for that is they understood that it was very heterogeneous. There was social, physiological, and organizational, interactions that were happening. There were lots of different stakeholders. There was no one single authority. Very often there was a delay between trying to intervene with the system and things happening. There was this attribute of unintended consequences, and we'll come on to that in terms of they intervened and they actually got a result they didn't expect. They understood that the system was actually constantly moving, and basically the crisis was evolving, and it still is evolving. And they also understood there were gaps in their knowledge, and there were parts of the system they didn't understand very well, and there were parts of the system they didn't understand at all. So they decided that the better approach was actually to apply systems modeling and systems thinking to this whole systems issue in terms of healthcare emergency. And so one of the first times that agencies began to sort of use this sort of modeling to actually approach some of the healthcare challenges going forward. Now, one of the attributes of a system is very often, and this was an example of the opioid crisis, in terms of you get an unintended consequence of an intervention. And very often this is called the Cobra effect. So a bit of background to why it's called that, and it was basically called that because it originated from an issue the British had in India in terms of the number of snake attacks. So basically the authorities decided to try and reduce the number of snake attacks to actually offer a bounty for every dead snake that was handed in. So it seemed quite sensible and reasonable that that would drive the more snakes were caught, and basically the number of snake attacks would go down. It seemed quite logical. However, this reward encouraged individuals to actually breed the snakes for the reward. So basically, they bred them in their back rooms, and basically they could get a reward for handing in a snake. And at some point, the authorities realised what was going on and decided that they weren't going to sort of pay for dead snakes anymore, and basically that sort of reward stopped. And the consequence of that is the snakes that were bred were actually unable to be sold, and the breeders simply released them into the wild, and hence there was an explosion in the snake population, and then hence the outcome was actually the opposite, the one originally hoped for, in terms of the number of snake attacks went up. So basically, very often systems, when you try to intervene with them, you get a different effect or a different response you expect, or you might even get a completely unintended consequence of trying to intervene within a system that's moving. So if you apply systems thinking to the QMS, and really the FDA it understands that your organization is a system, they're looking at obviously the healthcare challenges within that specific example in terms of drug addiction as a system. They also understand that your business is a system, and obviously your QMS by definition is a system. So the approaches that the FDA are taking will eventually translate into the expectation that the sort of strategies they're using to sort of try to understand the environment and try to sort of try to drive positive outcomes. They would expect you to be doing the same sort of things within your organizations, and understand that your organization is actually a system in terms of the way you operate, and the way you sort of design products, and the way the whole of your QMS operates. And really, I think it's the time that very often we talk about the QMS as a system, but very often it's not really treated as a system. We really should start thinking it more as a system that's actually living and breathing and operating. So a systems approach to the quality management within healthcare, it's not a new concept. It is very, very applicable to the management of quality in terms of looking at it as a system. And the reason for that is that poor quality within healthcare has a real potential for patient harm, and through either through human error or inappropriate application of procedures or medicine. And really, the healthcare setting, as lately been described, or very recently described, as actually one of the best environments to understand a systems approach. And the reason for that, there are very often multiple groups, and there's handover of critical information, but between them, if you look at a hospital in terms of how data is actually moved through the system in terms of that information, there's lots of handover points. Very often within healthcare, there's no one area that's responsible for any single process. There's sort of a collective ownership of a process, but there's no one individual that says, well, actually, I own this process. And very often there's an absence of a natural team that would encourage collaborative working. And this really describes a healthcare environment, and this was taken from a paper which explains why a systems approach within healthcare, within quality management in healthcare, is very appropriate. But actually, in the bold, those 3 points were probably are not dissimilar to many quality organizations, and you've got multiple groups handing information through a system. You've very often got no ownership of a process. Basically, very often you get these orphan processes where really nobody owns it, and very often the organization, especially the quality organization and the operational organization, there's no natural team to encourage collaborative working. So the systems approach to quality management is actually quite useful, because it's very reflective of some of the challenges described on this slide. Now, one of the aspects of systems thinking is this concept of underlying causes that actually drive the system. So if you look at it's termed the iceberg model, and so on the left hand side, you basically got a problem or event that manifests itself, but below the waterline you've got the trends that haven't got to a problem or event yet, and then below that you've got how the underlying system behaves, and then below that you've actually got culture in terms of how the culture of the organization drives this how the system behaves, that manifests itself in trends, and eventually it manifests itself in problems. So the actions, very often the action to a problem or event is a very knee-jerk one. You want to react to it, but the appropriate reaction to a trend is try to anticipate and prevent. and when in terms of reacting to a system, then obviously a redesign and a better understanding, a redesigner of the system is appropriate. And if you really want to get down to the sort of the base of the iceberg, really, and you want to change behaviours and viewpoints, then you've really got to look around education and training in terms of changing behaviours. So on the right-hand side is sort of some examples within the quality area. Very often a problem event would be a recall, but as we described in the previous session, in terms of very often that's preceded by near misses, and that is very often preceded by a number of deviations or non-conformances, and below that are things that are never non-conformances or deviations. They're just opportunities that happen that are never documented. They don't turn into anything in the quality system, but they are sort of things that are happening on a daily basis that are driving a subpopulation of them that are driving the deviations, and then a subpopulation of them are driving the near misses, and then ultimately a very small population of them are driving the really big events such as recalls or field actions. Now, one of the concepts of the outcomes of unintended consequences, very often you have targets that very often drive the wrong behaviours. So one example of that, and then this is this focus on metrics in terms of driving the wrong behaviours. A good example is in the UK, in terms of a number of years ago, the UK government decided that there was going to be a 4-hour wait, the maximum wait between arriving at an emergency room and actually seeing the doctor. And it was set in around 2000. It's still in place. It's been around for many years. And basically, it was trying to drive, with credible intentions to improve patient care such that you were seen in a timely manner if you turned up at hospital with an emergency. And you had to either be seen or be transferred to another department or basically discharged. And since the introduction of this target, there's been many attempts to meet this target, but many hospitals have been shown to be widely abused their systems in terms of their practices to try and meet this target. And the conclusion is since the target's been in place in really over 20 years now, then there's been nearly sort of £820 million spent on it in terms of trying to meet this target. But there's been no impact in overall patient care in terms of a positive impact. So basically, this target has driven a large amount of incorrect behaviour within hospitals in terms of trying to meet this target. Either moving individuals to corridors so they're not officially within the emergency room, and there's lots of been quite weird practice within hospitals to try and essentially buck the system to show you're meeting this target, but it hasn't actually translated into any positive overall patient care. So this slide really sort of explains, be careful in terms of the targets you set, because they can drive quite inappropriate behaviours, which can actually be counter to the outcomes you want. So, and I'm sure we'll come on to I'm sure there are targets within organisations that you know of that are driving the wrong behaviours, and we'll cover some of those in terms of the QMS. So going back to the hospital, these are some of the behaviours that these poor targets caused. Very often, the hospital would focus on that target as opposed to other things they should focus on, but they weren't measured, so there was less interest in some of the valid areas they should have been sort of addressing. Very often, they wouldn't focus on the most ill patients because they required excessive care, and even some behaviours, bullying of staff to achieve targets. It caused a general undermining in certain hospitals of professional motivation. Individuals felt they were actually, driving to meet or coming to work to meet a target as opposed to actually helping patients. It also caused one of them is the ceiling effect, and basically it removed incentives for further improvement beyond meeting the target. So if you get to the target and you actually, you don't have to do any more because you've done the minimum that was required. And it's certainly the hospital, there's a lot of distorting of the data and then presenting the data in a strange fashion in order to prove that you'd met this target. And basically, very often data was used that was used to deny there was any form of underperformance. So this is not just applicable to hospitals. Very often, if you set the incorrect target and you set the incorrect, compensation for meeting that target, very often it will start to drive quite strange behaviours, which are very often counter to the ones that you actually wanted in the first place. So in terms of these unintended consequences in the QAMS, so some examples include, tracking non-conformance numbers by area very often results in an underreporting of the issues, as as quality events are sort of driven underground. So if managers of areas feel that they're being penalised for raising non-conformances, very often this drives a behaviour to sort of keep them hidden. Very often, if you measure kappa cycle time, it can encourage quite weak investigation. If you're measured in terms of how quickly you can get through the phases of kappa, very often you can get through the phases of kappa really quickly, but your investigation is very poor and your corrective actions are very weak. Similarly, monitoring complaint closure rates in terms of how quickly you can close a complaint doesn't really measure whether that the customer that complained actually is truly satisfied, but you're measuring how quickly you can close it, and therefore you're actually compliant. um, Another example is internal audits that are held for basically compliance reasons, and basically, it's basically a show, and you don't really get to the true deficiencies, and they're hidden, and they're only exposed doing when the real inspectors come in from outside and actually and do a proper inspection. So basically, these internal audits very often can turn into very very weak audits in terms of not really uncovering the things they really should do in terms of gaps in your quality system that you need to address. And there are other examples. Other examples, end of year inventory targets are very often where driving behaviours where lots are manufactured at the very end of the year, and they're shipped to the customers. The customers even don't need the lots, but because you need to get rid of the inventory from your plant, you want to ship it at the end of the year. And very often you have this strange situation where it's neither on in the distribution centres books, or it's neither on the manufacturing plant's books. It goes into limbo at year end, because it drives this need to show that your inventory level at the year end is low. So basically it drives some quite bizarre behaviours. And I'm sure you can think of other things within the QMS where you set a target and actually it drives a behaviour you don't actually expect or want. Now, we talk about the QMS as a system, and one of the concepts of what happens to the system when it comes under stress. One of the biggest stresses of the QMS is actually doing a product recall, because you've got lots of different interactions during the investigation, doing the reaction to that, during sort of the PR around that event. So, as in this diagram, I've got all of the sort of things that generally happens in terms of a high level, recall. Usually, a customer complains. Basically, it's captured, the complaint's reviewed, it's reported, there's an investigation, there's a kappa. So at a high level, it's very, very simple, very sort of calm. You've got different quality system processes all sort of interacting. You've sort of got kappa, change control, non-conformance, management review, complaint handling. So you've got lots of subsystems within the QMS touching each other. You've got lots of resources and capability becoming stretched. You've got R&D, distribution, senior management, quality, reg affairs, external agencies, operations, maybe some stats knowledge. It gets thrown into the mix. So you've got lots of different resources all moving at the same time, and lots of QMS processes all actually happening at the same time. Out around that, you've actually got, these are all the things you can measure, and you can measure all of these aspects. You've got things that it's more difficult to measure in terms of numbers. You've got politics and opinions and feelings, and anyone who thinks that organizations and processes act like machines really should live within a recall investigations, because they will appreciate there's a whole plethora of things that are happening within the system that's happening on a day-to-day basis in terms of the sort of qualitative world, in terms of beliefs and opinions, and very often these beliefs and opinions are far more powerful than the things you can measure in terms of the metrics and logic that live within this numeric world that we can measure. So basically, a great example of a QMS coming under stress is actually doing a product recall, and then another example is when you get a sudden unexpected inspection from a regulatory body. Then the whole system, becomes under a huge degree of perturbation and stress that really does stress it to its limits at times. So now onto some sort of practical tips for dealing with systems. The important thing, seems obvious, but look at the whole and act as the whole. You need to look at the whole system. You need to see the QMS not as separate systems, but as a whole. and very often it's useful to divide the QMS into little bits in terms of ease of analysis. But you need to really only have a clear understanding of how those little bits actually interact and impact each other. So an example would be sort of the Holy Trinity, which is in the non-conformance and the kappa and the change control procedures. Non-conformance deals with what's the problem, kappa's what's the fix, change control how it's implemented, and obviously they all compete for the same resource. So basically, they're all for any given event. Very often, those subsystems will be interconnected and influencing each other. And really, it's really quite important when you look at it. When we look at quality system management review later, not to look at the quality system as discrete units, but actually start to see it as an entity and a larger breathing entity in terms of a system that's moving. We covered some of the issues in terms of trying to address problems in the previous session in terms of, are you addressing the real problem or a symptom? So really you need to sort of start working out what are the things below the waterline in that sort of iceberg model you're trying to address. Are you reacting to the symptom and the recall at the top, but you're actually not addressing some of the underlying issues in terms of the system, how a system behaves in terms of design, and also how the culture is actually driving how that system behaves. So basically, you need to look, if you need to look below the waterline in terms of trying to address some of these sort of underlying causes of issues that you're seeing the symptoms of higher up. To understand the system, it seems easy, but it's actually very difficult. You need to understand the problem, and that involves asking questions. And very often it's asking questions you don't know the answer to. And so it's not asking questions to validate your own views, but to truly understand how the system's behaving. And things you need to be asking yourself is when you look at the system, is this opinion or fact? Can I verify it? You need to get to the truth, and it really separates sort of what is opinion versus measurable fact. And basically, persons' opinions and perceptions is reality. So that's how they see their world. And really, you need to listen to the organisation and people who understand and enact parts of the quality system to really get a real understanding of how it's actually behaving, rather than from the documentation or your perception of how your QMS is actually functioning. So in addressing, issues with systems, you really got to take a step back at times and conclude, does this really matter? Do I need to do anything about it? And really, the only way to answer that is to put yourself in the customer's shoes. And really, there are multiple, customers you need to actually consider, and you obviously need to, balance. Are you satisfying one customer versus dissatisfying another? You got to ask yourself, really, is this just a storm in a teacup, or do I really need to address it? Conversely, if you start to intervene, you may actually start to intervene and actually implement changes in one area that may have little benefit or a detrimental impact on that area. But generally, they may have a greater good when applied across the whole board in terms of the whole system. So you may have practices you need to, or interventions you need to make that don't seem to help in one area, but actually when you take a step back and collectively they will actually help the broader organisation. And really, your job as the quality leader is to understand the nuances and the nuts and bolts of the subparts of the system, but be able to take a step back and see the entity as a whole in terms of how you're going to manage and sort of influence the behaviour of the whole system. What you need to do is actually, obviously you need to look at data, but you need to look for patterns. When you take systems approach, you look for patterns in the data that don't tell you so much in isolation, but when they build up, you can actually see patterns that are actually giving you a lot of information. For example, errors or defects across the system driven by patterns, are they related to the same thing in terms of ineffective training? Is there commonality? Are they related to seasonal events in terms of staff turnover or end of year deadlines? So basically, you're looking for hints in terms of connections between dots across the different parts of your quality system. And though the individual data points won't tell you much, your challenge as the leader is to sort of connect those dots together to sort of understand the bigger picture. And it's not easy, but because you're basically trying to look at disconnected parts of the system and then try and knit them together to see it, to get a better understanding of the system as a whole. One of the things in terms of intervention in systems is you don't get what you want straight away, and basically sometimes you need to wait for results. We live in an age of instant gratification in terms of you intervene and you get an instant reward, and that sort of expectancy has sort of pervaded into business in terms of very often there's an expectation you intervene in an area and that you suddenly get the benefit from that. But in the real world, that doesn't always happen in terms of that instant gratification. And that's not what happens with the system view of an organization. Very often actions take time to take effect, changes take time to bed in, and very often there are teething problems. And with the interconnected nature of systems, it will take time for those changes to work through the subsystems. So don't expect an instant reward in terms of once trying to modulate a system. You will have to intervene and then see how the system behaves at times in terms of getting reward. But it's a case of what's the bigger reward by waiting and truly understanding the system versus trying to do a quick fix and actually finding you're not getting what you want, and actually if anything you may find intervening with the system is actually giving you a response that you didn't expect, or actually counter to the one you hope for. So in summary, we need to treat the quality system for what it is, a system, and not just a collection of isolated processes. And don't expect to change one part of the system without perturbing another. And if you want to truly, understand the system, you need to look at the whole system and really understand the whole system before acting, and also look for underlying causes, the causes below the waterline that may precede some of the higher events. And finally, beware of trying to intervene with the system and actually getting something you don't expect in terms of unintended consequences. So this is quite common. So basically, don't be surprised if by trying to modulate or change the system, you're actually getting an outcome that you didn't quite expect. So this is a systems approach to the QMS, and we're going to explore that a little bit more in the next module. We're going to talk about complexity, where the link between cause and effect isn't always apparent, and complex systems are even stranger in terms of your ability to impact them and actually influence them. But actually, complex systems really do explain how the real world operates on a day-to-day basis, and certainly your quality organization is a very complex beast, as we shall see in the next session.